I put the transfer request on his desk face up, and I had a whole speech ready, and I did not get to use a single word of it. He read it through twice, which is more attention than that man gives most homicides. Then he squared the paper against the edge of his desk, and without looking up, he told me it was denied. When I asked on what grounds, he said that he decides which of his people are replaceable, that I was not on that list, and that if I wanted to spend my talent writing up stolen bicycles by the river, I could do it after he retired. 3 years I had worked for that man. 3 years of being told my reports were adequate, which from him is close to a parade. He had never once told me I was good at anything, and then, standing closer to that desk than I needed to be, in a building where every one of us wears duty blockers because scent contaminates evidence, I smelled him. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, back to the story. Our unit had the 3rd floor of a building the city had quietly given up on. The elevator worked when it was in the mood. The window unit in the squad room made a noise like a man clearing his throat, and the board at the front of the room had been carrying the same 3 photographs since the previous autumn. We called him the blank. Nobody thought it was clever. It was what the lab kept typing on the scent panels that came back from his scenes. Nothing detected, not a partial, and not even the ordinary human soup you get in any room where somebody has been living and dropping coats over the backs of chairs. Nothing at all. A room scrubbed down to nothing does not smell clean. It smells wrong, and your body knows it before your brain catches up. And I had stood in 3 of those rooms and walked out of every one of them with a headache sitting behind my eyes. My job in that unit was names. Everybody else chased people. I sat in a room with the blinds down and 4 monitors and turned garbage into names. A camera above a loading dock. A face that was a handful of pixels and nothing else, and I would take the shoulders and the length of the stride and the little hitch a man gets in his left leg when he has broken an ankle at some point in his life, and I would give the room a name and an address. I read ears. Ears are better than faces, and nobody ever thinks to cover them. I ran the scent index too, which nobody else in that building could read properly, because a scent signature comes back to you as a chart rather than a smell, and charts lie if you are lazy with them. Sloan used to say I was the only person she knew who could look at a wall for 9 hours and then tell everybody the wall's mother's maiden name. Sloan had been on the unit longer than anyone, and had reached the stage of her career where she said whatever she liked to whoever was standing there. She ran the coffee fund badly, and the betting pool well. And then there was Marek. You have to understand how he was, or none of the rest of it makes sense. Marek did not do warmth, or encouragement, or any of the small social oil other bosses use to keep a room moving. He came in before us and left after us. He wore the same 2 coats in rotation, and when he spoke, he used the smallest number of words that would carry the meaning, and not 1 word more. If you brought him a theory with a hole in it, he found the hole in about the time it takes to sit down, and he told you where it was, flatly, in front of everybody, and then he waited for you to fix it. He never yelled. I have never once heard that man raise his voice. He did not need to. When Marek was disappointed in a briefing, the temperature in the room dropped, and everybody suddenly had somewhere else to look. The district hated him and could not touch him, because his unit closed cases. He was the youngest lieutenant in the building, and there was a story that the district had tried to move him up and that he had said no, and nobody knew whether it was true, because you did not ask Marek anything. I had been in love with him for going on 3 years. I never did anything about it. I was not pining across a desk with my chin in my hands. I did my job, I did it well, and I kept the whole thing folded up small and put away. And the only outward symptom was that I could not look at him for longer than a moment. He would look up from a file, and our eyes would catch, and I would find something absolutely urgent to do with a monitor. Every time, for as long as I had been there. If he ever noticed, he never gave a sign, and Marek not giving a sign was the most reliable thing in my life. There was a night early on, my first winter in the unit, when the storm came in hard, and my car would not start in the lot, and everybody had already gone. He came out, looked at the engine for a while, told me it was the alternator, and then drove me home across a city that had turned to soup without saying anything for the entire drive. When we pulled up outside my building, he said, "Get the alternator done." And I said I would. And that was the whole conversation. I thought about it more than I would like to admit. The thing that finally broke me was not cruelty. It would be a better story if it were. It was a Thursday, and the district had sent an inspector to look at the blank file. Because the better part of a year with nothing is the kind of thing that makes people in nicer buildings nervous. We had put the second victim's last hours together the week before, and the piece that made the timeline work was mine. A bus camera, a reflection in the door glass of a pharmacy, and a woman crossing a road in the wrong direction long after the last person who admitted seeing her said she had gone home. That was days of my life. That was me not sleeping. The inspector stood in front of the board with his hands behind his back and asked how the identification had been made. And Marek said, "My unit put it together." That was it. That was the whole sentence. He did not look at me. Nobody looked at me, because nobody in that room had any reason to. And I stood at the back near the window unit that sounded like a man clearing his throat, and I understood, with a completeness that was almost restful, that I was going to do this for another decade or two, and then retire. And at the end of it, Marek would shake my hand at the door and tell me my service had been adequate. I went back to my own room at the end of the corridor, and I did not cry, because I am not built that way. But I sat there with the monitors going and did not see any of them. In the corridor outside the evidence room that same afternoon, there was a man in gray coveralls up a stepladder, changing the filters in the air scrubbers, and I said, "Excuse me," and stepped around the bottom of his ladder without looking up at his face, the same as everybody in that building did every few weeks. The same as you step around furniture. I started the transfer request that night at my kitchen table. The station out by the river is a small one. 2 shifts, a front desk, a sergeant named Marlene who has run the place since long before I joined and treats it like a family business. Bicycle thefts, break-ins at the marina, a stolen boat trailer once a summer. They had an opening for someone who could do identification work, which for them meant pulling a plate off a bad camera, which for me meant a nap. It was a demotion in everything but pay, and it was a long drive from my apartment in the wrong direction. And the important thing, the only thing, was that he would not be in the building and I could have my life back. I filled the form out more than once because my handwriting kept going wrong. Then I put it in my bag and carried it around for days like a man carrying a live thing. I had reasons, and they were good. Adult, sensible reasons. And I had rehearsed all of them in the shower. Career development, broader responsibility, a quieter caseload. Not one of those reasons was the reason, and I knew it, and I had made peace with lying to a form. What I had not planned for, in any version of the speech, was that he would say no. I did it on a Tuesday morning, before the briefing, because I wanted it over with. His office is a glass box in the corner of the squad room with blinds he never closes, which tells you most of what you need to know about him. He was standing when I came in, going through the overnight sheets, and he did not sit down, so neither did I. And I remember thinking that was fine, that it would be over quickly, that I would be out of there and it would be done. I put the form on his desk face up and I said, "Sir, I'm requesting a transfer." He picked it up. He read it. He read it a second time, and I have watched that man read a preliminary autopsy report faster than he read those few lines, and while he was reading, I got through most of my speech in my head and lost the thread of it about halfway. Then he put it down and squared it against the edge of the desk with 2 fingers, and he said, "Denied." I said, "Sir." He said, "You heard me." I asked him on what grounds, and I said it politely, which under the circumstances, I think was generous of me. He finally looked up, and Marek's eyes are a very ordinary brown and there is nothing poetic about them at all, and he said, "On the grounds that I decide who in this unit is replaceable, and you are not on that list, and you are not going to be on that list, and I am not signing a form that hands the best identification officer in this district to a station whose largest active case is a boat trailer." I stood there and did not move, and I have replayed the next part more times than is reasonable, and I still cannot tell you why I did not simply leave. What I said was, "Sir, with respect, my work is documented. Anyone can be trained to do it." And he said no. Just that, no, like a door closing. Then he said, and this is the part that got repeated around the building for a week, "If you want to spend your talent writing up stolen bicycles by the river, You can do it after I retire. He said it without any particular edge in his voice, as though telling me the coffee was out. I asked whether that was an official denial or a personal one. That was the closest I have ever come to insubordination, and I heard my own voice do something unattractive on the word personal. He said, "It's the only kind I give, and that was when it happened. And I need to explain the building for this to land properly. Everybody on a major crimes unit wears duty blockers. Nobody takes them to be polite. It is in the standing orders. Scent contaminates a scene, and a scene that has been walked through by an unblocked alpha is a scene that gets torn apart by a defense attorney at trial. So we all take them. You take them in the locker room at the start of shift, and you take a second one out of your coat if the shift turns into something else, which in that unit it usually did, and you smell like a mopped floor all day and you stop noticing. Merrick had worn them every shift for as long as I had known him. Years of it, in a small building. I had ridden in cars with that man. I had stood shoulder to shoulder with him over a body. I did not know what he smelled like. It had never once crossed my mind that I might, because he was the strictest man in the building about the protocol, and he took his in front of everybody the way other men take something for their blood pressure. And standing there in his office, with the form squared against the edge of his desk between us, I got the smallest piece of something, brake dust off a car that has been driven hard and just stopped. Black licorice root, the bitter kind, the kind that is not really candy. And under both of those, something dark and sweet, like a dried date. It was there, and then it was not there, coming and going like a note when a door opens somewhere else in a building, and I stood in that office with my mouth slightly open like an idiot. He said, "Was there anything else, detective?" And I said, "No, sir," and I got out. The squad room had heard the whole thing, because his blinds are never closed, and the glass in that building is decorative rather than functional. Sloane did not even pretend to be working. She had her chair turned around and her arms folded on the back of it, and she watched me cross the room with an expression I did not care for. She said, "So that's a no, then." I said I was going to go and look at a wall for 9 hours. Rudy from the K9 unit was leaning in the doorway eating somebody else's food. And he said, in the tone people keep for lottery numbers, "He called you the best in the district." I said he called me not replaceable, which is different. Sloane said, "Honey, in all the years I have worked for that man, I have never once heard him say a sentence like that about a person. The betting pool started that afternoon. I know because I found the sheet in the break room, folded, with my name on it, and columns for how many attempts it would take, and whether I would still be there at Christmas. Somebody had written no chance in the margin, and somebody else had crossed it out and written, have you met him? Being told you are not replaceable by a man who has never praised you is not the good news it sounds like. It feels like being told the exact size of your cage. I went home that night and sat in my car in the lot outside my building for a while. And I thought about that piece of brake dust and licorice, and I decided I had imagined it because the alternative was a man who had let his blockers slip in the middle of denying me an exit, and that made no sense at all. So I went around him. You can do that. It is not a good idea, and it does not make you popular. But the district takes transfer requests directly if your commanding officer sits on one, and there is a form for it, and I am extremely good at forms. I filed it on the Friday. I did not tell anybody. I felt clever for a few days. On the following Wednesday, Merrick came out of his glass box in the middle of the morning with a sheet of paper in his hand, and the room went quiet, and he put the sheet on my desk, face up, exactly the way I had put mine on his. It was a personnel designation. He had marked me operationally essential to an active serial investigation. There is a box for it. Almost nobody uses the box, because using it means you are formally telling the district that a case will suffer if this person is moved, and if the case then closes without them, you look like a liar in writing. It freezes transfers, and not for a week either, but for as long as the investigation stays open. The blank case had been open since the previous autumn and had nothing in it but dead ends. I looked up at him and I said, "Sir, this is indefinite." He said, "Correct," I said. "You've frozen me to a case that may never close." He said, "Then we'd better close it." Sloane made a sound at her desk that she turned into a cough. Merrick did not look at her. He looked at me for slightly longer than his usual second, and then he said the thing that changed the shape of that whole summer for me. He said, "The second victim's timeline exists because of you, not the unit. You. The pharmacy glass was yours, and so was the walking direction, and I have 4 people out there knocking on doors who would not have seen it in a year of looking. When this case turns, and it will turn on paper and not on a door coming off its hinges, I'm not going to have the district ask me who found it, and be told I let him go to the marina." Then he took his paper back off my desk and walked into his office. I sat there with my ears ringing. I had built my entire understanding of that man on the fact that he did not say things like that. I had made a whole life out of it, and now here he was, in the open squad room, in front of everybody, listing my work back to me line by line, which meant that he had been watching it line by line, all that time, and had chosen, deliberately, every single day, to say nothing. Sloane rolled her chair over. She said, "You all right?" I said, "He's never done that before." She said, "No, he hasn't." I said, "Why now?" And Sloane, who has more years in than anyone in that building, said, "Because you're going." Then she nodded at the glass box, where our lieutenant was standing with his back to the room, and she said, "Look at him. He's been on the same page since you sat down." The 4th room came at the end of that week, in a building above a tile shop, and it was the worst of them, because she had been there for days before anybody found her. I do not want to spend long in that room, and neither did anyone else. What matters is what was not in it. The technicians ran the panels twice on site and once at the lab, and every single one came back the same, nothing detected. In a closed apartment, in warm weather, you understand what that means. Wiping surfaces does not do that. He had run something industrial through the air, the kind of neutralizer they use in slaughterhouses and in labs and, as it happens, in police evidence rooms, and he had run it long enough to strip a place down past zero. Somebody put her photograph up on the board that afternoon, and nobody said anything while it was going up. Everybody in that unit was chasing the man. I stood in the doorway with my hand over my mouth, and I started thinking about the machine. I said it out loud at the briefing the next morning, which I would not normally do, because briefings were for the people who worked doors and theories, and I was the man at the back who produced names when he was asked for one. I said that a unit capable of doing that to a closed apartment is not something you buy at a hardware store, that it is licensed equipment, that licensed equipment gets serviced, and that servicing leaves paper. There was a pause. Somebody said that we had been down the purchase records months ago. I said purchases were not the same as service. I said a machine gets bought once and serviced forever by somebody who signs a sheet each time. Marek was standing at the side of the room with his arms folded, and he let the silence sit there long enough that I started to want to die. Then he said, "That is the first new direction this case has had since it started. Do it." Somebody actually turned around to look at me. He said, "And get him whatever he needs. And if the licensing office gives him the runaround, they can explain the delay to me personally." I took that professionally for about as long as it takes to cross a squad room. What I actually did was go back and sit very still, with both hands on the desk, because here is the pattern I could not make fit. He was blocking my exit and building me up in the same breath. Every time he made it harder for me to leave, he handed me something bigger to do. And he said it where people could hear it, and by the end of that month, people in the building who had never spoken to me were saying my name in corridors. For years I had been furniture, and now I was in briefings. Now the captain knew my name and used it, and told me the identification work on the second victim had been the only good news the district had all year. I could not enjoy any of it, because I could not tell whether it was true or whether I was being managed. The service records were a nightmare, by the way. I mention it because I was on that paper for weeks, and it is what eventually broke the case. And from the outside, it looked like slow drowning in paperwork. Licensed neutralizer units, servicing contracts, subcontracted maintenance, technicians who moved between companies over the years. I built a chart nobody but me could read, and in the middle of all that, I made one more run at leaving. Marlene at the river station was holding the position for me, which was decent of her and not something she had to do. I called her and explained the operational freeze, and she said, in the flat tone of a woman who has been in this job forever, "Well, He can't hold you forever." And I said, with more feeling than I intended, "You have not met him." Then I went and knocked on the glass box. I said, "Sir, if the freeze is about the case, then the case is the only thing that should be in it," and asked whether he would give me a date. Any date. A month I could put in my head and count toward. He said no. I said, "Sir, that is not a reason." He said, "I'm not required to give you one." I said, "You are, actually. In writing. In section 4. And he looked at me for a moment with an expression I would describe as somebody discovering that his dog can read. So he gave me reasons. Over the following weeks, whenever the subject came up, he gave me reasons, and I want to lay them out in order because they get worse. The first one was legitimate, and I hated it. He said the service records were mine, that nobody else in the building understood the chart, and that handing it to somebody else would cost the case months. That was true. I could not argue with it. The second one was that I was the only person in the building who could read a panel once the lab sent it back, and that without me the charts would go out to the state analysts and come home in weeks instead of the same afternoon. Also true. Also infuriating. The third one was that I had the only working key to the good filing cabinet. I said, "Sir, there is a locksmith in this city." He said, "I'm aware of the existence of locksmiths." Detective. The fourth one was a mandatory professional development course that he had personally enrolled me in, which ran through the winter, and which he informed me was a requirement for my grade. I checked. It was not a requirement for my grade. It was not a requirement for anybody's grade. It was a course about report writing. I had been writing reports for years. When I raised this with him, he said that everybody's reports could be better, including mine, which was the first time he had ever criticized my work, and I am fairly sure he made it up on the spot. The fifth one was that the K9 handler's dog did not like anybody in the unit except me, which was true, and which had absolutely nothing to do with anything. Rudy, when I told him, laughed so hard he had to put his coffee down. He said, "He's using my dog. He's using my actual dog." Sloane said the pool had been extended and that she had money on the winter. I stopped sleeping properly around then. I could blame the case. The case was part of it. But the real problem was that every day I went into that building and sat across a room from a man who had spent years telling me nothing, and had now started telling me, in public, in that flat voice with no music in it at all, that I was the best in the district, and I did not know what to do with my body when he said it. And then there was the night in the car. We had a name off the service records, a technician who had done work in 2 of the buildings, and it was almost certainly nothing. But almost certainly nothing is how this job goes, so somebody had to sit on his street for a night. Marek took it himself, which he did not have to do. And he took me, which he really did not have to do. And if I had been thinking clearly, I would have wondered about that. It rained the entire night. Not dramatic rain. The gray, endless, boring kind that gets into the car and makes the windows go opaque so you have to keep running the blower. He had bought 2 coffees on the way and handed me mine without comment, and we sat there in the dark watching a door that never opened. Around the middle of the night he started to smell. This part matters, and I have gone over it since more than is healthy. Duty blockers do not switch off. They wear down, and they wear down from the edges, and what comes through first is a thread of it, and never the whole. The other thing nobody puts in the standing orders is that a blocker only holds down what is quiet underneath it. Hold something hard enough under one and it finds the edges early, whatever the clock says, and that is why an omega going into a cycle comes through a fresh dose, and why a man who is angry will come through his by the middle of the morning. That is what happened in that car, at the end of a shift that had already been too long before we got into it. Mine had gone hours before that, and I had not thought anything of it, because everybody's due by the end of a shift like that one. His came off him in threads, and the first one was the brake dust, hot and mineral and close, and then the licorice root underneath it, and then last of all, later, when I had been sitting there not moving for a long time, the dark sweetness, the dried date, warm and low, and completely at odds with every single thing about that man. I sat with my coffee going cold in my hands and my heart doing something stupid. I said, "Sir, your blockers are going." He said, "I know." I said, "Do you want me to?" He said. No. Neither of us moved. The rain kept coming down on the roof of that car, and I sat there in the dark with the scent of my commanding officer filling up a space about the size of a phone booth. And I understood two things at once. The first was that he had been carrying that around under a chemical lid every shift, every day, for as long as I had known him, and that until the morning I put that form on his desk it had never once got out. The second was that it was not slipping randomly now. An alpha's scent tells you what he is doing. It is not a language exactly, but it is not nothing either. And what was coming off him in that car was not the flat baseline of a tired man on a stakeout. It had an edge on it. It had a tension in it. And it was pointed directly at the passenger seat. And it had probably been pointed there for longer than either of us was going to say out loud. I could not have got a word out. My own scent was doing something I could not control. And that is one of the great humiliations of my designation. And I knew he could smell it, because rhubarb and aloe and that green bitter dandelion note I have carried since I presented do not hide in a sealed car. He said, very evenly, without looking at me, "We should get the windows down." I said, "It's raining." He said, "I'm aware of the weather." He put both windows down. The rain came in across both our laps for the rest of that night, and neither of us mentioned it. And when the shift ended and the sun came up gray over the wet street, he told me the technician was clean, take the morning, and I got out of that car with my shirt soaked through and my hands shaking, and I sat in my own vehicle in the lot for a long time before I could drive. He was unbearable for the whole of the next week. Not loud. Marek is never loud. He simply went back behind the chemical wall twice as thick as before, and he stopped putting himself anywhere near me, and he sent his instructions to me through Sloan, which in a unit of that size is roughly the same as putting up a notice. When I did have to be in his office, he stood on the far side of it, and he answered in single words. And once, when I asked him a perfectly reasonable question about a warrant, he said, "Work it out, detective," in a tone that made the room outside go quiet. Sloan said, "What did you do to him?" I said, "I sat in a car." She said, "Well, stop it." I handled the following weeks with no dignity at all. What I did was file a grievance. If the freeze would not move and the reasons would not stop getting more insane, then I would make somebody upstairs look at it. And you make somebody upstairs look at anything with paper. The union rep in that building was a beta named Ingrid, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the emotional range of a filing system. And she took my complaint, and she said she would pull my personnel file, and a few days later she called me down to a windowless room on the second floor and slid the whole thing across the table. She said, "You are entitled to read your own file. Take your time." And then she went and stood in the corridor, which I did not think about at the time, and have thought about a great deal since. Most of a personnel file is nothing. Certificates and fitness scores and a commendation from my first posting for something I can barely remember. I went through it faster and faster, looking for the freeze. And I found the freeze. And then I kept going backward out of habit. And that is when I found the other thing. It was dated my first winter in that unit. The winter of the alternator. The district had run a staffing review. There is a version of this memo in every department in the country, and it is always the same memo. Efficiency, head count, duplication of function. It listed me by name and grade, and it proposed that identification work for the unit be centralized at the district lab, which is a polite way of saying that the position I sat in would stop existing. And there was a second line under it, which was not about money. Someone at the district had written that assigning an Omega officer to active scenes raised avoidable contamination risk, and that centralization would resolve it. I sat in that little room and read that sentence more than once. Then I turned the page and found his reply. It was a few lines long. Marek does not waste words even when he is furious, and I could tell he was furious because he had typed it himself, and the man cannot type. It said that the contamination argument was not supported by any incident in the unit's history. It said that the officer in question ran the scent index that the district itself relied on, and that in a matter of months he had closed a case 4 detectives had not, and had been credited for none of it. It said that the officer was the best he had. And the last line said, "I will not sign this. And if the district signs it over my objection, they can have my resignation in the same envelope." Underneath the memo, clipped to it, was a document that had no business being in my file at all, and I worked out later that this was why Ingrid had gone and stood in the corridor, so that nobody could say she had watched me read it. A promotion offer. Captain. At the district. In the good building with the working elevator. Declined. And in the box where they make you write a reason. In his handwriting, which is terrible. 4 words. I intend to stay. There was another one from the following year. Same offer. Same 4 words. I do not remember standing up. I remember Ingrid's face when I came out into the corridor, and the fact that she did not look surprised, and that she said, with nothing in her voice at all, "Take the stairs. He's in the evidence room." That walk down the stairs was not happiness. I was so angry I could not feel my hands, because he had known, not recently, not since the transfer. He had known what I was worth in my first winter, when I was still learning where the good coffee was, and he had put it in writing to people who could have ended my career, and he had turned down a captaincy twice with 4 words, and then he had come into work the next morning and told me my report was adequate. Every day. A choice made on purpose by a man who is never careless with anything. He was alone in the evidence room, standing at the long table with a box open in front of him, and he looked up when the door went, and then looked back down again. Which is Marek, for hello. I put the memo on the table and he looked down at it. Then he said, "That's a personnel document." I said, "It's my personnel document." He said, "Ingrid gave you that." I said, "Do you want to talk about Ingrid? Or do you want to talk about the fact that you wrote this and never said 1 word of it to me?" He straightened up. There is a thing he does where he goes very still before he answers something he does not want to answer, and I had spent years cataloging it without knowing what it meant. He said, "It wasn't your business." I said, "I was the subject of it." He said, "It was handled." I said, "Everybody in that building knew there was a review that winter. Nobody was ever told how it ended. I spent months waiting for a letter, and you had already killed it before Christmas, and you let me go on waiting." And then I said the thing I had been carrying up the stairs. I said, "You never told me. 3 years, and not 1 word of it. And now that I have a foot out of the door, you cannot seem to stop. You told the district. You told the captain. You told an inspector in a room I was standing in, and you said my unit. And you knew then. And you have always known. Why was I the only person in this building you never said it to? And Marek, who has an answer for everything and dismantles other people's theories for a living, said nothing at all. He put both hands flat on the table. I said, "That's what I thought," and I turned to go, and he said my name. He used my name, not my rank. And I have heard that man say my name a handful of times in all the years I worked for him, and every single one of them was in a corridor with other people in it. This was not that. This came out of him low and slightly wrong, like the word had been used for something else and he had not adjusted it back, and I stopped with my hand on the door because my legs had stopped taking suggestions. He said, "Because if I had told you, you would have known." I said, "Known what?" He said, "Everything." And then whatever had been holding it down stopped holding, and I still do not know whether that was the dose giving out or him, and it did not arrive as a thread this time. The room filled up with brake dust and licorice and that impossible dark sweetness underneath, all of it at once, and it was pointed at me like a hand pointed at something it means to pick up. I do not entirely remember crossing the room. I remember the edge of the table against my back and then not against my back, because he had moved me. 1 hand at my waist and the whole of his forearm along the shelf behind my head, and he stopped there with about an inch of air between us and did not close it. He said, "Tell me to stop." I said, "No." He said, "I'm your commanding officer." I said, "I've been trying to fix that for 2 months, and you keep saying no." That got me 1 breath of something that was almost a laugh, and it went across my mouth, and then he kissed me. There was nothing gentle about it. It was every year of a man saying nothing arriving at once. He kissed me like he had already lost the argument. My hands got into the front of his shirt and I pulled, and he made a low sound against my mouth that I felt in my back teeth. And then his hand came up under my jaw and tipped my head back so he could get at my throat, and the scent came off him so thick that I could taste it, brake dust and bitter root and that warm, dark sweetness that I had spent weeks convincing myself I had imagined. My own scent went up like something spilled. He put his face against the side of my neck and breathed in, and his hand tightened at my waist, and he said something into my skin that I did not catch and have never asked him to repeat. I got my hands under the back of his shirt. I remember the shock of how warm he was, and the fact that he shook once, all through, like a car does when the engine turns over, and that the most controlled man in that building was breathing like he had run up the stairs. He kissed me again, slower, and that was worse, because slow means a man has decided something. And then his phone went. He did not answer it at first. It went again. And then mine went too, which in our unit means one thing. And he put his forehead against mine for the length of about one breath and said a word I had never heard him use. The blank had left a fifth room, and this one was ours, in the sense that it was a few streets from the building, and in the sense that when the panels came back, for the first time since the whole thing started, they were not empty. What was in the fifth room is the least dramatic thing in this entire story, and it is the reason a man is in a cell today. The panels came back with a trace, and it was not human at all. It was the carrier agent that industrial neutralizer is suspended in, and it had settled in the seal of a window that had been painted shut some time in the last century, and whatever his machine could put into the air of that room it could not pull back out of a gap that size, and the lab could name the formulation, and the formulation was specific to one manufacturer's units. A formulation will not give you a man. What it gives you is a make of machine, and there are not many of those in this city, and every one of them is licensed. I did not sleep much for days after that. I went through the licensing register, and the service contracts, and the subcontractors, and I built out the chart until it covered the wall of my room with the blinds down, and Marek came in twice a day and stood behind me and looked at it and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anybody did for me that week. We did not talk about the evidence room. Not for days. He was courteous and exact with me in front of the unit, and he did not come within arm's reach of me once, and I told myself that was sensible. And I hated it. Then, late on a night when everybody else had gone, he came and stood in my doorway with his coat over his arm and said, "I'm going to sign it." I turned around. He said, "When the case closes. I'll sign it, and I'll write the recommendation, and Marlene at the river will get the best officer she has ever had." Then he stopped and said the rest of it to the doorframe rather than to me. He said, "And then I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as your lieutenant. I have thought about it for 3 years, and I am not doing it while I am the man who signs your evaluations." I said, 3 years. He said, "Don't." I said, "You've had 3 years to say something," he said, "and every single day of it. Saying something would have made me the kind of officer who leans on his own people." So, I didn't. And then, quietly, he said, "I'm aware of what that cost you. I've watched it cost you. I decided it was better than the other thing, and I'd like you to believe that I thought about it every day, because I did." I said, "I looked away first every time because I thought you'd see it." He said, "I saw it." I said, "Since when?" He said, "The alternator." I would tell you what I said to that, except that I did not say anything. He put his coat on, and on the way past he put his hand flat on the top of my head for a moment, which is the least romantic gesture in the history of the world, and I sat in my chair afterward and could not have told you my own name. My cycle came due the following week, which was outstanding timing. I have been on suppressants since I was a teenager, and they have always held. And they mostly held that time too, but the edge of it got through, as it sometimes does when you have not slept and have been standing in rooms full of the worst thing a person can do to another person. And I felt it start in the middle of the afternoon in a briefing. Preheat is not the main event. Preheat is your own body giving you notice. It is a warmth that starts low in your back, and a restlessness, and a sudden hostility toward the fabric of your own shirt. You can still stop one at that stage if you are quick. Once it has properly started, you cannot. And anyone who tries to put suppressants into an omega who is already in it is going to end up explaining a drop to a doctor. The problem is that it is not silent, and whatever was left of my blockers by that hour was not going to cover it. I got up and left the briefing, and I heard the room change behind me, and by the time I had got to the corridor there were 2 alphas from another unit at the far end of it who had turned around. Marek came out of that briefing a few steps behind me. He did not touch me. He put himself between me and the far end of the corridor, and he said, without any particular urgency. "Gentlemen," and the two of them found business elsewhere in a hurry. Then he said, "Keys," and I gave him my keys. And he drove me home in my own car with the windows down and did not say a word for the entire journey, which was familiar. He walked me up. He said he would wait outside until my suppressants took, because a breakthrough at the edge like that can go one of two ways, and going home alone is how people end up in emergency rooms. I said that was not necessary. He came in anyway. My apartment is small and I have not decorated it, and there was nothing in the fridge but condiments and half a lemon. He stood in the middle of it with his hands in his coat pockets and looked around at my entire life and said, "You don't have a chair." I said I had a chair. He said, "You have one chair." I said I lived alone, and then heard myself say it, and turned around and started doing something unnecessary at the sink. I got the suppressants down. They take a while. In the meantime, the warmth kept climbing my back and my skin had gone stupid, and I was extremely aware that the man standing in my kitchen smelled like brake dust, because he had come out of that building without redosing. I said, "You should go." He said, "Do you want me to go?" I said no, which was honest. And then I said, "Please go," which was also honest. And he understood both of them, because he did not move. I turned around and he was closer than he had been. Not touching. He is very careful about the distance he takes up, that man. And he had put himself exactly at the edge of the space where you have to choose, and left the choosing to me, which is either the most respectful thing anyone has ever done for me, or the cruelest. So I chose. I got a fistful of his shirt and pulled, and he came, all at once, and my back hit the counter and his mouth was on my throat, right over the gland, not biting, just there, breathing, and the sound I made was not dignified. His hands went under my shirt and stayed at my ribs, warm and unmoving, the whole weight of them, and I could feel him deciding. I got my leg around the back of his and pulled him in, and he swore into my collarbone and said my name, and then said, "We are not doing this while your body is doing that," and I said something extremely rude about his sense of timing, and he laughed, actually laughed, with his mouth against my skin, and I felt it go all the way down. He kissed me one more time, slow, and it went on longer than either of us meant it to. Then he moved my hands off him one at a time, which took him more than one attempt, and he stood on the far side of my one chair with his hands in his pockets and told me to drink some water. He stayed until the suppressants took. He sat on the floor with his back against my door, in his coat, and he was still there in the morning, asleep, sitting upright, as though he had done it before, and I lay in my bed with the warmth ebbing out of my back, and I thought, this is the best week of my life, and I was not wrong about that. It was. The conduct notice arrived on the Friday. The first thing I thought about was the camera in the evidence room, and I stood at my desk working out from memory that it covers the cage door and the sign-in sheet, and not the long table at the back, and then I felt sick for having worked it out at all. The notice came from the district conduct office, and it was addressed to him, and it was copied to me, and the thing that put me down on the edge of my chair was the first line of the summary. It said the inquiry had been opened following a grievance filed by the officer concerned. My grievance. The one I filed to make somebody upstairs look at the freeze. They had looked, and what the conduct office saw, when they looked, was this. A supervising Alpha officer had refused a transfer request from an Omega subordinate. He had then refused it again through a rarely used essential designation, indefinitely, on a case with no end date. The subordinate had filed a grievance, and the fleet office, which audits pool vehicles for scent traces because those cars carry evidence, had flagged a vehicle because the audit swabs, seat fabric and not air, and both of us were in that fabric at a level that put a note on the file. I had been in that car. I had put my own name on the log. Read it in that order, with no faces attached, and there is only one story it tells, and it is not ours. It is an old, ugly one that happens in departments all the time, and the reason the conduct office exists at all is that for a great many Omegas, it is exactly what happened to them. They interviewed me first. Ingrid sat in as my representative and did not look at me once. The conduct officer was polite and thorough, and asked whether I had ever felt pressured, and whether the essential designation had been explained to me, and whether any conduct of a personal nature had occurred prior to or during the refusal of my transfer. I said no to the first. I said yes to the second. And then I sat there with my mouth open on the third one, because I do not lie well, and because the true answer was that nothing had happened prior to and everything had happened during, and there was no version of that sentence that did not end his career. Ingrid said, "My officer would like a short break." In the corridor, she took her glasses off and told me the part nobody had said out loud yet. She said, "Listen to the shape of it. If they decide it was going on while he was refusing you, the finding reads as a supervisor keeping an omega he had an interest in, and that is a dismissal and he never works again. If it started after, it is a reporting line problem, and somebody gets moved and he keeps his job. Everything turns on which side of that line the dates fall, and on whether two people who were not allowed to speak to each other tell the same story in 2 rooms on the same afternoon." Then she said, "Second thing, and you should hear it from me. Your identification work is the spine of that serial file. Put a relationship in front of them, with the officer who assigned your work and blocked your transfer, and defense counsel stands up in that courtroom and says your findings were made to please him." Then she said, "They do not have to prove any of it. They only have to say it out loud in that courtroom, and it will be in every report of the trial. 5 women, and a year of it, and a window seal that had been painted shut since before any of us were born." I said, "So I have to say nothing happened." Ingrid said, "You have to say what is true." Then she put her glasses back on and said, "He will not let you lie for him. Prepare yourself for that." She was right. Of course she was right. So I went back in and I gave them dates, because dates were the only thing I had that was worth anything. Every refusal with the day it happened on, the grievance with the day I filed it, and then the first time anything happened between us, which was after both of those, in an evidence room, and I told them that I had crossed that room and not him. I said all of it out loud to 2 people I had never met, with Ingrid writing beside me, and it is the worst thing I have ever had to say in a room. They took him in the same afternoon, and it lasted longer than mine did, and I sat in the squad room and watched the door of a conference room like a dog, and Sloane came and sat next to me for the whole of it without saying anything, which is the single kindest thing that woman has ever done for me. When they came out, Marek walked to his glass box, and then he came back out of it with a sheet of paper, and he crossed the squad room to my desk, and everybody in that unit found something to look at. He put the transfer form down in front of me. My form, the original one, with the corner soft from being carried in a bag for days. He had signed it, and underneath the signature he had withdrawn the essential designation, 1 line. And it takes about as long to write as it takes to say. The conduct office had voided it that morning in any case. He said, "Effective at the end of the month." I could not get anything out. He was looking at me like he looks at a scene, taking all of it in, missing nothing, and he said, "For the record," and loudly enough for the room, "This transfer was requested by the officer months ago and refused by me without adequate cause. That refusal was mine. Nothing about it was his doing." Then he went back into his office and closed the blinds, which I had never once seen him do. I caught him in the stairwell that evening, because I am not a good enough person to let a thing like that go. I said, "Don't do this." He said, "It's done." I said, "You told them it was without adequate cause. That's a lie. You had 5 reasons and 2 of them were true," he said, "and 3 of them were a filing cabinet, a course that does not exist, and a dog." I said, "Look at me." He did, and that was the worst part, because whatever he had been holding in that conference room he was not holding anymore. He said, "If they find a relationship, they find your work was compromised." Then he said, 5 women, and stopped, and started again, which he never does. He said, "I can take the finding. I can't be the reason that man walks out of a courtroom, and I'm not going to be another one of them in this building. The ones who keep an omega exactly where they want him and call it the case." I said, "That isn't what this is." He said, "I know what it is. That isn't what's in the file. And the file is all they've got." I said, "So what happens?" He said, "You go to the river. Your name goes on your own work from a desk I cannot touch, and then nobody can say a word about it." He said, "And you and I do not speak until it is over." I said, "And after?" And he said, "I can't promise you that." I said a number of things then that I am not going to repeat, And the last one was that he was a coward, which was not true, and I knew it was not true when I said it, and he took it without a word, standing there on the landing with his hands at his sides, letting me put it on him because he had decided I was allowed to. He went up the stairs and I went down them. And I cleared my desk on the last day of that month. The unit had a card. Sloane hugged me and told me that if I ever wanted the pool money, she would arrange for me to win it. Rudy brought the dog. His office door was shut, and the blinds were down, and he did not come out. The river station has a window over the desk where they put the identification terminal, and for the first days I could not get used to working in daylight. Marlene gave me the tour, which took a few minutes, and then a stack of bicycle thefts, which took less. The coffee was better. Everybody went home at the end of shift. Nobody's blockers ever slipped, because out there you only dose when there is a scene to protect. And there almost never is. The first week I told myself it was relief. The second week I started checking my phone in a way I was not proud of. He did not call, because he had said he would not. And Marek does not say things he does not mean, which is a quality you admire in a man right up until it is aimed at you. Sloane called on Sundays. She is not a subtle woman, and she made no attempt to pretend she was reporting. She said the unit was slow without me. She said the district had put 2 people on the service chart, and both of them had given it back. She said the conduct finding was still sitting somewhere upstairs and that everybody knew what it was going to say. And once, near the end, she said, "He's not sleeping. He's in that building at 5 a.m. I've told him. He told me to work my own caseload." I said, "Tell him." She said, "Tell him what, honey?" I did not have an answer, so I said nothing. And that was most of my autumn. What I did instead was work. I requested the licensing and service records again, in my own name, through Marlene's station, on a station reference number, so that whatever came of it would have a clean line back to a desk that Marek had nothing to do with. Then I got up in the dark and worked the chart before my shift, and I did the bicycles. And then I sat in that little station in the evening with the river going gray outside the window and worked it until it was late, and I told Marlene exactly what it was, because she was the one whose reference number was on it. She looked at the wall of paper I had built in her back room and said, "Well, it isn't bicycles," and went and made tea. I was not being noble. I was doing the only thing I had left that connected me to him. The break came out of a subcontractor's timesheets, which is the least cinematic sentence I will ever say. The licensed units had come back to a handful of servicing companies, and the servicing companies had subcontracted, and the subcontractors had used the same handful of certified technicians moving between them across 2 years, and that is why the purchase records had never gone anywhere. I stopped looking at companies and started looking at people, and I built a calendar of every technician's logged jobs, and then I put the 5 rooms on the same calendar. One name had serviced units within a few streets of every one of those 5 rooms, in the weeks before each one of them. His name was Dolan, and he held a scent-neutral certification, the thing the licensing body issues to technicians who work with the equipment, and which requires you to be scent tested every other year. That register is not a list anybody can search for a killer. It is thousands of names held by a licensing body in another city, and it is worth nothing at all until you already have one name to put into it. I had one name to put into it. His baseline was on file, and it was almost nothing at all, which is what that trade selects for and why he was good at it. The reason the panels came back empty was not only the machine, it was him. A man who works in that trade all day carries almost nothing of his own by the end of it. I had no business pulling a living man's personnel file out of anywhere, and I did not. What I looked at instead were the servicing contracts he had been sent out on, which are published procurement notices, and which anybody in the country with an internet connection is entitled to read. That is where I found the one that made me put my cup down on Marlene's backroom table hard enough to crack the saucer. For years, his company had held the maintenance contract for the air scrubbers in our building, our evidence corridor. He had been up a ladder outside that room every few weeks, changing filters, invisible, while a serial file with his handwriting all over it sat in a box on the other side of the wall, and every single one of us had said "excuse me" and stepped around the bottom of his ladder. I sat in that quiet little station by the river and I could not breathe properly. Then I did the thing I am actually good at, because a contract is not a man and I was not going to send anybody a name I had only read off a piece of paper. I asked Sloan to send me the camera material from the second victim on a request logged at both ends, because I was not putting a hand on anything that was not written down somewhere. Then I went back through the street camera I had already been through until my eyes gave out, and this time I was not looking for her. There is a van at the top of the frame for about the length of a breath, and a man in coveralls at the back of it with his head turned away, and I have never in my life been so glad that people cover their faces and forget about the rest of themselves. Nobody thinks about their ears. His were in the licensing photograph, and they were in my frame, and they were the same ears, and they were the same ears. What I did next matters, and I did it on purpose, and it is the one smart thing I did in the whole of it. I did not call Merrick. I called Sloan again, and I told her what I had, and I sent the chart to the captain directly, with a covering note, and I copied the district, and I wrote it as a river station officer submitting information to a unit I no longer belonged to, with dates and sources and the identification set out the way I would set it out for a court. My name on it, my work, my reference number, and nobody anywhere in it who had ever signed my evaluations. It did not scrub the first year of it, and nothing could, but the name came off a desk he had no authority over, and the name was the piece a defense counsel would have wanted. Then I went and did a stolen bicycle in the Marina car park, because my shift had started. They took Dolan days later at a service call, quietly, with the machine still in the back of his van. Sloan called me from the parking lot afterward, and I could hear the whole unit behind her and somebody, I think Rudy, shouting my name. She said, "The captain read your note out, word for word, to the room." I said, "Was he there?" She did not ask me who I meant. She said, "He stood at the back and he didn't say anything. And when the captain finished, he left the room." And then she said, "And I found him in the stairwell, and he had his hand over his mouth, and I have known that man for 11 years and I have never seen anything like it, and if you tell him I told you, I will deny it in writing." The conduct finding came down at the end of that month, and it went against him, as everybody had known it would. Improper use of an essential designation, a note on his record that will be on it until the day he retires. Ingrid told me later that the dates were the whole of it. His account and mine matched to the day, and neither of us had been given 5 minutes to agree a story. And the office does not often get handed 2 versions of a thing that fit that well. Nothing had happened between us while he was refusing me, and both of us said so in the same words. So what they were left with was a relationship that started after a grievance had already been filed. That is a reporting line problem. They wrote a direction that the reporting line be broken, and they wrote the designation up as improper. And the second of those was the one that cost him. I heard about the other part from Ingrid, who called me herself, which I did not expect. She said, "I read the record of his interview, which I am entitled to do because your grievance is what opened the file, and I am telling you one thing out of it, and then never again. He never mentioned you once, not even where it would have helped him." Then she said, "He submitted a request the same morning the finding was issued. Voluntary transfer out of major crimes. He asked for the River District." I said, "He asked for what?" She said, "And I should not be telling you this either. Administrative post, 2 grades below what he has now. No unit, no command, and nobody anywhere in his reporting line, which is the entire point of it. They have approved it. He starts after the new year." And then she said, in exactly the same voice she uses for everything, "I have watched a great many alphas explain themselves in that room, and I have never once come out of it feeling the way I feel about this." I said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because he will not." He came to the river station on a Tuesday in the first week of December, at the end of my shift, and he stood at the front desk in his coat with the rain coming off it while Marlene took her time deciding whether to let him through. I came out. He looked terrible. He had lost weight he did not have to lose, and he looked like he had been sleeping in a chair. And when he saw me, his whole face did something and then stopped doing it. Because he is who he is. He said, "I'm not here as anything. I want that clear. The findings issued, the files closed, and I'm out of that unit in January." I said, "I know," Ingrid called. He said, "Of course she did." We stood there. There was a radiator ticking somewhere and Marlene was pretending to file. He said, "I came to say one thing, and then I'll go if you want me to go." And then he did not say it for a while, And I watched him stand in a doorway and fail to find a sentence for the second time in my life. What he got out was this. He said, "I let you think I didn't see you." Then he had to start over, because that was not the whole of it. He said, "That's the part, not the transfer, not the freeze, none of the things they wrote down. 3 years, and every day you looked away first. And I knew exactly why you were doing it. And I let you keep thinking I hadn't noticed, because being your lieutenant was easier than being a man who had to do something about it." He stopped there long enough that I thought he had finished. Then he said, "I told myself that was decency. It was not. I had what I wanted, which was you in that building where I could see you, and I paid for it out of your pocket and not mine." Then he said, "I'm sorry," and it came out wrong, like a word he had not had in his mouth for years. I said, "You turned down a captaincy twice." He said, "I did." I said, "4 words." He said, "I'm aware of what I wrote." I said, "You'd have told a personnel form before you told me." He said, "Yes." And then his voice did what it had done in the evidence room, only worse. And he said, "Anyone. I'd have told anyone before you. Everyone else could say no to me and it wouldn't have cost me a thing." I got hold of the front of his coat, and the rain went through my sleeve, and I pulled him down and kissed him in the doorway of a police station in front of a sergeant who has run that place since long before either of us turned up. And Marlene said, "Out, both of you," without even looking up. My cycle arrived days later, properly, the whole thing. I had come off the suppressants after the breakthrough at the end of the summer, because the doctor at the district clinic took one look at what riding them through a breakthrough had done to my blood work and told me she would rather I took my chances with the cycle. So it came when it was due, on time, for the first time since I was a teenager, and it came like something that had been waiting. He was there for all of it. Not out of instinct. He asked me, at the door, before it got bad, whether I wanted him to stay or wanted him to go and call somebody else, and he made me answer him out loud with my own mouth while I could still think straight, and I have never loved anybody the way I loved him for making me say it. The rest of that week is mine, and I am not going to hand all of it over. What I will tell you is that the fever came in waves, and that between them, there was a man in my kitchen who could not cook, working his way grimly through the only 3 things he knows how to make, that he built the nest with me, badly, and let me redo it, twice, without one word of comment, that he sat on the floor with his back against the bed and let me put my face into the side of his neck for hours at a time, right against the gland, breathing him in until my own head went quiet, and that at some point in the middle of the worst night my scent and his went into each other and made something. Neither of them was on its own. Something like a street the moment after the sweepers have gone through, when a whole block smells briefly like something new. He did not bite me. He would not that week, not while I was in that state, and would have agreed to anything. And when I told him so afterward, in language that was frankly ungracious, he said, "Ask me in the spring." I asked him in the spring. He is at the River District now, in an office with a window and a caseload that would bore a traffic warden. And he is happier than anyone who knew him in that other building would believe. He has rewritten the station's evidence procedure, and Marlene has adopted every line of it. Marlene calls him the lieutenant, purely to annoy him. There is a form for a relationship inside a department, and we filed it in the first week we were allowed to, both signatures and a date on it, sitting where anybody who wants it can find it, because a thing you write down yourself is a different animal from a thing somebody digs up, and he was not going to let anyone dig anything up about me ever again. He has a note on his record and a bond mark I put on him the night I asked him, and one he put on me before the sun came up, and I know for a fact which of those things he thinks about. The blank case has a name on it now, and a trial date, and the identification went in from a desk he had no authority over, dated and referenced, which was the whole reason for the worst months of my life and a good part of his. Sloane retired the following summer and gave me the betting pool money in an envelope at her party. Nobody had won it, on the grounds that the sheet had gone into a bin during the inquiry, and no result was ever declared, which I believe was Sloane's decision, and not the pool's. Rudy's dog still likes me best. And in that little station out by the river there is a filing cabinet with a bad lock that only opens for me. And a copier with a code that nobody else has bothered to learn. And my Alpha, who is the coldest man I have ever met, and lies about it constantly, has written to the sergeant, in a memorandum with a reference number on it, to inform her that I am operationally essential, which is not a thing an administrative post has any authority to declare about anybody, and which Marlene has pinned to the notice board by the kettle. The end. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.